I love horror games, and I have to admit that I also love good gore. There's nothing as satisfying as having a head go boom in, for example, the I2 remake, or the suspense and shock when seeing a shitload of blood down a corridor. For me, gore is an enjoyable part of these games, even though I'm sounding like I'm crazy. But how did it change in all these years of horror games? And which are my highlights? It's hard to find a proper starting point, but the first System Shock is for me probably the most interesting and impressive, considering the time it came out. I've actually made a short video about that game's gore before for that reason. Completely ahead of its time, they managed to incorporate the gore into the world design. There are many instances where there are writings on the walls, like "stay away" or "here". This will be an obvious choice in a game from today, but not in the early 3D era. There are also limbs and bones lying around everywhere, and you are able to decapitate some enemies, as you can see here. And in my opinion, it still looks very good. There are also blood splatter when you attack enemies, and even though that were only 2D sprites and similar stuff was already seen before in, for example, Doom, I still think that System Shock is a great example of how the gore we have today was born. But jumping 2 years ahead, and we get to the game I'm talking about in almost every video. The first Resident Evil. And compared to System Shock, it's actually not that different. It's just a bit more gore overall, that is also a bit more immersive, because there's a lot more 3D now. Instead of just 2D sprites that are decapitated, there are now fully modeled limbs that can explode, and that the player can shoot off. You can even shoot off the arms, which isn't even possible in some later IE games, and for example the spiders can be completely nuked with explosives. There's also a blood puddle after an enemy is completely dead, which isn't that impressive technically, but still interesting as a gameplay aspect. The game also uses blood on the walls and floors, and the characters will even acknowledge it, like with Barry in the beginning, or later in this hallway. It's interesting that both Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 couldn't really expand on this amount of gore, except for simply more enemies, and Code Veronica even turned it down again a few years later, with no more exploding heads and limbs. The death animations can be quite gruesome as well, especially the Hunter. Overall, it's still a pretty gory game, even today. But a game that turned the horror up even more was Silent Hill with its gore. Stuff like the beginning scene, pretty much all of the other world, or later in, for example, the school are much more gruesome than everything Resident Evil did. And although the enemies don't explode as dramatic, there's still a similar amount of blood present. In opposite to Resident Evil, the player and enemies can bleed, which means that there are blood traces every time something gets hit, which is kinda horrifying and brutal in a way Resident Evil isn't, because everything feels that tiny bit more real. At least in my opinion, Silent Hill never managed to get back to these levels of gore again though. Even though the amount of blood is similar in, for example, Silent Hill 3, there's no game that is that consistently as gruesome in the series after that. The only real candidate would be Silent Hill 3, but I think it lacks a bit in the visual design part compared to the first game. Although parts like the dipshit in the Hilltop Otherworld gave it a run for its money for sure. But do you know what's also red like blood? The subscribe button before YouTube decided to change the design. And according to my YouTube analytics, a lot of you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, even though you watch my videos. So please do so if you enjoy this video, because this would greatly support me. Thank you, and let's continue. Another notable game is definitely Manhunt. Released in 2003 by Rockstar. That shit is just brutal in a completely different way. Although there aren't these disgusting otherworlds, like in Silent Hill or the crazy amount of enemies you encounter in Resident Evil, it's still just batshit insane. It's basically a killing simulator where your goal is to kill people in the most gruesome way. It's so bad that it's even banned in my home country, Germany. The executions are extremely violent, especially because it's on humans and not on some weird monsters. You can stab others in the head, hit them with different weapons, strangle them, stab them, chop off their head, and even more. Just typical Rockstar insanity turned to 11. And there's even a sequel. Dead Space feels almost sane in comparison again, but not only do you have to dismember the enemies, kinda like in Manhunt, but Isaac gets murdered brutally in pretty much every possible scenario. At least in my opinion, the dismemberment of the enemies isn't that gruesome, because there isn't a lot of blood, at least in the original games and compared to other games I mentioned. But the death animations are extremely brutal, because Isaac gets torn apart or sometimes even worse pretty much every time. But in terms of general gore, the remake is a whole different story again anyway. For me, probably the creepy shit is also extremely gory is when the skin gets blasted off their bodies and you have a skeleton sprinting at you, which was added in the remake and wasn't present in the original games. But apart from that, Isaac and most side characters have a really bad time as well, like I already said. Most characters in Dead Space 1 are brutally impaled by necromorphs, which is already very bad, but even then Dead Space 2 is another level again. There's that poor guy in the beginning, the baby that blows up a woman, the needle machine, more ripping Isaac in half, and even more considering that the whole station gets fucked up. In general, there are just a lot of brutally murdered people in Dead Space, probably more than every other game I have mentioned so far. Apart from that, there's also that whole blood on the walls and floor thing again. I would argue the shoot of the limbs in the beginning of Dead Space 1 is probably the most iconic of that in all of gaming. Especially with the Dead Space remake, the series is definitely one of the goriest AAA horror franchises out there. But going almost full circle, I want to get back to Resident Evil again. Firstly, I want to mention Resident Evil Gaiden, simply because I like how they still try to be gory even though it's only on the Game Boy Color. Like, look at this, it's pretty decent. Anyway, like I already mentioned, Code Veronica turned down the gore, and with the more action-focused games in the following decade, they never really got back to it until Resident Evil 7. Resident Evil 4 had exploding heads again, and for example the Chainsaw Man can even decapitate Leon. Apart from that, there are also a few gruesome moments in the beginning, like some bones in the first house, the lady on the wall, or the burning policeman. But overall, there isn't anything too bad after that in my opinion. The same is true for Resident Evil 5 and 6. Even though they have small horror moments, there's never really anything too crazy or shocking, which makes sense considering the direction they try to go in. I mean, extreme violence and gore isn't the best for mainstream appeal. And like I said, that only really changed with Resident Evil 7. In that game, Capcom truly loved to brutally violate everything that wasn't on the tree after 3 seconds. Ethan loses his hand after 20 minutes of game time, Jack loses his head quite literally several times, the policeman's head gets chopped in half, that weird ass Marguerite boss fight, Lucas' weird Saw games, and even more. And then there are of course the enemies that have exploding limbs again. In my opinion, the game is the most gruesome Resident Evil game as of right now, as Resident Evil Village continued the tradition of chopping Ethan's hand off, but is a lot more tame otherwise. The Resident Evil 2 remake is very gruesome as well, but not as insane. Although it has the best and most satisfying dismemberment system of any Resident Evil game, and for example the torn up head in the beginning is very much disgusting, and there's probably a lot more blood than any other Resident Evil game. Unfortunately, the Resident Evil 3 remake is more tame in comparison again, and doesn't feature the dismemberment system in such a good form, because limbs can't be separated anymore. The Resident Evil 4 remake is decently gruesome again, but not as disgusting as Resident Evil 7. But the dismemberment definitely reminds me of the Resident Evil 2 remake, with shootable limbs and a lot of blood. They also turned up the enemy design from the original Resident Evil 4, with more gory details for most enemies. For example, look at Dr. Salvador or the Garrador in both games. Another gory and recent game is the Callisto Protocol, and the gore was arguably the best part and also the part that was marketed the most. There were even plenty of articles before release and even a DLC that adds 14 new ones. Similar to Dead Space, the main protagonist gets absolutely violated by all enemies. Apart from that, there are also plenty of possible ways to kill the enemies with the environment, which is pretty unique in that form and pretty brutal. But there are plenty of deaths where the head of the protagonist Jacob gets stormed, or usually his whole body gets torn apart completely anyway, and even more. They were pretty damn creative in that aspect. The DLC ending is also extremely gruesome, but I don't want to spoil that. But in general, it's easily one of the most gory games currently available. And with that we come to the end of this video. I'm aware that I didn't cover a lot of games, but I will make another part of this series when I simply have played more games so that I actually know how brutal some of these are. But in general, I will say it's pretty clear how games are getting more gory again, after being a bit more tame in the early 2010s. Thanks for watching, please comment, share and subscribe, and see you next time.